There was music before there was anything else. Not the music of instruments or voices, though those came later. The music of the world itself. Wind through forest, water over stone. The particular silence after rain in the mountains of Thrace, when the trees are still dripping and the air smells of earth and pine and something else, something with no name that you recognize immediately even though you have never encountered it before. Orpheus heard all of it. From the time he was a child on the slopes of the Thracian mountains, he heard what other people could not hear. The pitch of the river in the gorge below his village. The harmony of wind moving through different kinds of trees simultaneously. The rhythm that the seasons kept, not just their cycle, but their texture. The specific quality of light in late autumn when it comes at an angle through bare branches and falls on frost. He did not choose to be a musician. He was one before the choice existed. The lyre came later, the gift, some versions of the story say, of his father Apollo, the god of music and light. When he first played it, the stones moved toward him. The rivers slowed. The wild animals of the Thracian forest, wolves and bears and eagles, came and sat near him and listened. This is not metaphor. This is what the ancient sources say. And what they are saying, beneath the extraordinary imagery, is something very simple. Some music is so true that the world reorganizes itself around it. Right now, as you're watching this, someone else is watching it too. A different country, a different time zone, a different life, but the same quiet hour. Tonight, we explore the story of Orpheus, the man who remembered everything he lost together. If this is your first video here, take a look around. Subscribe if it feels like home, and leave a comment. Your location, your time. That small act of saying, "I'm here," does something. It reminds all of us that we're not as alone in this as the dark sometimes makes us feel. Dim the lights. Maybe pull a blanket over yourself if there's one nearby. Let's begin. Imagine standing on a hillside in ancient Thrace, which is roughly the region that is now northern Greece and Bulgaria, on a clear morning in early spring. The forest comes down to the edge of the river. The mountains behind you still carry snow on their upper slopes. The air is cold enough to see your breath, but the sun is warm on your face. That particular contradiction of early spring in mountain country that makes you feel, simultaneously, like winter is ending and like it will never quite end. And from somewhere in the trees above you, music. Not a performance, not someone practicing, just someone playing, the way a person might hum to themselves while walking naturally, without thinking about it, as an expression of something that has no other form. The music stops. A wolf that had been standing at the edge of the tree line turns and goes back into the forest. The river, which you had not noticed slowing, resumes its normal pace. This is what it was like to live near Orpheus. The ancient poets, Pindar, Ovid, Virgil, all describe his music in terms of its effects on the natural world, rather than in terms of sound itself. Because the sound, apparently, was beyond description. You could describe what happened to things when they heard it. You could not describe the sound. The stones drew near. The trees uprooted themselves and moved to be closer. The rivers bent their courses. What this tells us, underneath the mythology, is something about the nature of genuine art. Genuine art does not entertain, it reorganizes. It reaches something in the listener, in the stone, in the river, in the wolf standing at the tree line that was waiting to be reached. And once reached, things are not quite the same as they were before. Orpheus had this power from birth. He did not always know what to do with it, and then he met Eurydice. The ancient sources are not always in agreement about how they met, but they agree on what it was like when they did. She was a nymph of the Thracian forests, which in the ancient tradition means she was a being of the natural world, not supernatural in the distant divine sense, but deeply connected to the living world in a way that ordinary mortals were not. She moved through the forest the way water moves through a landscape, finding the path of least resistance, going naturally where she was meant to go, without force and without hesitation. When Orpheus played, the forest came to him. When Eurydice walked, she was already part of it. What the ancient sources agree on is the quality of what was between them. Not simply love in the romantic sense, though it was that, something more specific. The sense of having encountered the one person in the world whose existence makes the world more legible.
Orpheus had always heard things other people could not hear, and he had always, underneath the music, been slightly alone in that hearing. The music was a way of sharing it, but the sharing was always incomplete. You can play what you hear, but you cannot make someone else's ears hear it the way yours do. With Eurydice, he did not need to play it. She already heard it. They married in spring. The ancient sources mention the wedding, and they mention it with a detail that reads, in hindsight, like a warning. The wedding torches sputtered. The smoke went the wrong way. The god of marriage, Hymenaeus, attended but said nothing. The ancient world read omens in such things, but people in love are not always paying attention to the smoke. They were happy, simply, completely, in the way that is only possible when you have found the person whose existence makes yours make more sense. And then the snake. The ancient sources differ on exactly how it happened, but they agree that it was sudden, that there was no warning, that one moment she was there, and then she was not. Eurydice was walking in the meadows. Some versions say she was fleeing the unwanted attention of a shepherd named Aristaeus. Some say she was simply walking when she was bitten by a snake hidden in the grass. She died quickly, and Orpheus, who could move stones with his music, who could bend rivers from their courses, who could make wolves sit quietly at the edge of a tree line, could do nothing. This is the first and most important thing the story wants us to understand about grief. It does not matter what you are capable of. Death is not a problem that capability can solve. Orpheus played his lyre after she died. The ancient sources describe this. He sat on the hillside above the Thracian forest, and he played, and the music was unlike anything that had ever come from him before. The trees that had moved toward him when he played in happiness now bent their branches as if leaning into a wind. The rivers stopped. The stones that had drawn near remained very still. The animals did not come to listen this time. They stayed at a respectful distance, the way animals do around grief. Because what Orpheus was playing was not music in the ordinary sense anymore. It was the sound of the world with something essential removed from it. Psychologists who study grief describe a phenomenon that has no clean name in English: the way the world looks different after a significant loss. Not just that things feel wrong, the way the light seems changed, the way familiar places have become subtly strange, the way a sound or a smell can produce a pain so specific and so physical that it is almost indistinguishable from being struck. Orpheus, sitting on that hillside, was experiencing something that every person who has loved someone and lost them recognizes. The world had been reorganized, and not by music, by absence. Before we follow Orpheus downward, I want to invite you to pause. Imagine a meadow at the end of a summer afternoon. The light is slanting, long shadows. The grass is very green and very still. At the edge of the meadow, the forest begins, dark and quiet and cool. Everything looks exactly as it should look, but something is wrong with the air. Not the temperature, not the smell, something more subtle. The quality of the silence between sounds. The way the light falls on the grass without quite landing on the thing you are looking for. This is what Orpheus felt every time he looked at the world after she was gone. Everything in its place. Everything as it should be. And the one thing that made the place make sense, absent. Breathe. Rest in that image for a moment. Most people, when they lose someone they love, are left with the same impossible options. You can grieve. You can continue. You can try, over time, to build a life that incorporates the loss rather than being defined by it. What you cannot do is go and get them back. Orpheus decided he was going to get her back. This is the moment in the story where the mythology and the psychology intersect most precisely. Because the decision to descend to the underworld alive, to walk in full possession of his senses and his body into the realm of the dead, is not presented in the ancient sources as madness. It is presented as love pushed to its logical extreme. If you love someone enough, the story seems to say, the boundary between the living world and the dead world becomes a question rather than a fact. Orpheus could move stones. He could bend rivers. The wild animals of the forest sat and listened. If his music could reorganize the living world, why not the dead one? This is extraordinary thinking, and it is also, the story will show us, thinking that contains within it the seed of its own failure. Because the underworld is not a place that responds to music the way the living world does. It responds to it differently.
More completely, and that difference is everything. He went to the entrance of the underworld at a cave near the river Styx, where the living world and the dead world came closest to each other. He played his lyre at the entrance, and the music went ahead of him into the dark, and the dark, for the first time in the history of the world, let a living man through. The underworld in the ancient Greek tradition is not hell in the Christian sense. It is not a place of punishment, at least not primarily. It is simply the place where the dead go. All the dead. The good and the wicked. The brave and the cowardly. The people who were loved and the people who were not. They all end up here, in the gray halls of Hades. in varying states of consciousness and memory. The shades, as the ancient tradition calls the dead, are not fully themselves. They are like copies of the living person, but faded, like a letter that has been left in the sun too long. Still readable, but the color gone out of it. Orpheus walked into this world playing, and what happened was something the underworld had never experienced before. The shades stopped. Tantalus, condemned for eternity to reach for food and water that eternally recedes, forgot to reach. Sisyphus, condemned to push his boulder up a hill for eternity, only to watch it roll back down, sat down on his boulder and listened. The Furies, the ancient agents of divine vengeance, whose faces were so terrible that mortals could not look at them, wept. The ancient sources say this carefully. They wept for the first time. Not from pity, exactly, from recognition. Because what Orpheus was playing was grief in its purest form. And even the agents of divine punishment, even the forces of the underworld that had processed every human death since the beginning of time, had not heard grief expressed like this before. It moved them. And this is the second thing the story wants us to understand about the nature of genuine art. It does not stop at the boundary between the living and the dead. It goes where it needs to go. He reached the throne of Hades and Persephone, and what he did next, and what they did in response, has been discussed by philosophers and poets for 2,000 years. Hades and Persephone are, in the ancient tradition, a complicated pair. Hades is the god of the dead, not death itself, but the realm of the dead. He is not evil. He is not cruel. He is simply the keeper of an absolute boundary. His job is to maintain the separation between the living world and the dead one, and he does it without exception, without appeal, without sentiment. Or so it had always been. Persephone is different. She is a queen of the underworld by circumstance rather than nature. She was taken from the living world by Hades, and her absence caused the seasons to fail, and a compromise was reached in which she spends part of each year above ground and part below. She knows, more than anyone in the underworld, what it is to be separated from the living world by a force you did not choose. When Orpheus stood before them and played, when the music of the living world and its grief came into the throne room of the dead, it was Persephone who wept first. Hades was moved, the ancient sources say, and Hades being moved is something the ancient world treated as genuinely extraordinary. The god whose defining characteristic was implacability, the keeper of the boundary that had never been crossed, was moved by a man playing a lyre. This is what the story thinks genuine art can do. Not entertain, not impress. Move the immovable. Hades agreed. Eurydice would be allowed to return to the living world. She would follow Orpheus up through the passage between the dead world and the living one, through the darkness, the long ascending path, with one condition. He must not look back at her until they had reached the upper world. Not once, not for any reason, not even to confirm she was there. Let's stay with the condition for a moment, because it is not arbitrary. It is the precise description of what grief requires. To bring someone back from loss, to reconstruct your life around them, to allow them to be present again, you must be willing to move forward without constantly checking whether they are still there. You must trust the process. You must resist the urge to confirm, to verify, to make sure. The looking back is not just a story mechanic. It is the most psychologically accurate description of the one thing that prevents genuine recovery from grief: the inability to stop checking. The inability to trust that what is following you is real without constantly turning to see it. Hades knew this, or the story knows it. Either way, the condition is not a punishment. It is a description of what moving forward actually requires. They began the ascent. Orpheus first, Eurydice behind him. The path upward through the underworld is described in the ancient sources as long and dark and steep. There is no light.
There is no sound except the sound of Orpheus's footsteps, and somewhere behind him, the sound of her footsteps following. He could hear her, or he thought he could hear her. This is the crucial ambiguity of the story, and it is the ambiguity that makes it true. Could he actually hear her? The shades of the dead are not fully material. They are, as we said, like faded copies of the living. Their footsteps might have been audible, might not. The ancient sources are deliberately unclear on this point, because the uncertainty is the point. Orpheus was walking in the dark toward the light, listening for the sound of footsteps behind him, and he could not be entirely sure what he was hearing. This is what grief recovery actually feels like. You are moving forward. You are choosing to move forward. You are making the effort, and behind you, something is following. Something that might be what you lost, returning, or might be the echo of what you lost, which is a different thing entirely. And you cannot know which it is until you arrive somewhere that has enough light to see clearly. If you can just keep walking, if you can just not look. He walked. The darkness continued. The path went upward. Somewhere far above there was light, the living world, waiting. He kept walking. And then, the ancient sources differ on exactly what made him look. Ovid says it was simply that he was afraid she was not there. Virgil implies that the moment was inevitable, that the outcome was sealed from the beginning. Both of them are right. He was almost there. The light of the upper world was visible ahead of him, faint at first, then warmer, then real. He was almost there. And in that moment, in the moment when the journey was almost complete, when the terrible thing he had done was almost undone, when he was almost back in the world with her behind him, he looked back. Why? The ancient sources offer different answers, and none of them are wrong. He was afraid she was not there. He wanted to see her face in the light. He could not bear another moment without knowing for certain. He was Orpheus, a man whose entire life had been organized around the act of turning toward things, of facing them, of expressing them. A man for whom looking away from what mattered was a form of death. The look was not weakness. It was who he was, and it cost him everything. Because the condition had been absolute, and the look happened before she had crossed the threshold into the living world. One step, perhaps less. The light of the upper world on his face, the dark of the underworld still on hers. And when he looked back, he saw her, for a moment. Her face. Her expression not angry, the ancient sources agree on this, not accusatory. Something more quiet than either. Something that recognized what was happening and had already accepted it. She said goodbye to him, and then she was gone, back into the dark. The second loss.
I want you to stop here with me for a moment. Not to think about what just happened. You already understand what just happened. Just to be in the place. Imagine the entrance to the underworld, a cave mouth somewhere in the ancient Greek world. Above it, the living world is loud with birds and wind and the sound of a river somewhere nearby. Inside the cave, just beyond the threshold, it is very quiet. Orpheus is standing at the entrance. He has just come back into the light. His hands are on his lyre. He is not playing. Behind him, the darkness of the cave. He cannot go back in. The underworld does not allow the living to enter twice, not even him, not even now. He stands there for a long time. The birds continue. The river continues. The world continues to be the world, just with that absence in it. Take a slow breath. Rest. He tried to go back. The ancient sources all agree on this. He went to the entrance of the underworld and tried to descend a second time. The way was closed. He sat at the entrance for 7 days, not eating, not sleeping, playing his lyre into the dark. The music went in. Nothing came back. Eventually, he left. He wandered through Thrace, through the mountains and forests that had been his world before Eurydice, the world he had filled with music since childhood. The trees still moved toward him when he played. The rivers still listened. But something had changed in the music. The ancient sources describe it as more beautiful than before, more beautiful and more heartbreaking. As if grief had deepened, it had added something that happiness alone could not produce. The sound of someone who has been to the underworld and come back with the knowledge of what it contains. He refused all other love. This is described in the ancient sources as a kind of loyalty to Eurydice, to the memory of what they had. Some versions of the story suggest that the Maenads, the frenzied female followers of Dionysus, resented this rejection. That when they tore him apart on a hillside in Thrace, it was because he had refused their advances. His body was scattered across the mountains, but his head... The ancient sources are very clear about this. His head landed in the river Hebros, and it floated downstream, still singing, all the way to the Aegean Sea and to the island of Lesbos, where it became an oracle, where for centuries afterward people would come to hear the voice of Orpheus, still giving, still singing, still offering something to the living from beyond the boundary of the living world. Even in death, the music did not stop. What does this tell us? That what Orpheus had, the gift, the capacity to make music that reorganized the world, was not in his body. It was not even ultimately in the lyre. It was in whatever it is that genuine art actually is, the thing that cannot be destroyed by tearing apart the person who made it, the thing that floats downstream and arrives somewhere and keeps speaking long after the speaker is gone. Every piece of music that has moved you was made by someone who is now dead. Every poem, every painting, every story. The makers are gone. The music is not. This is what the story of Orpheus is about, beneath the mythology and the grief and the impossible journey and the devastating look. It is about the indestructibility of what is genuinely made. The head floating down the river, still singing. The music going on without the musician. I want to come very close to home now, because the story of Orpheus is not a story about ancient Greece. It is a story about something every person who has loved someone and lost them, which is every person, already knows. The world looks different after a significant loss. Not worse, necessarily, not less beautiful, but differently weighted. As if certain things that used to feel important have been revealed as peripheral, and certain things that seemed peripheral have been revealed as essential. Orpheus went to the underworld for love. He came back with something he had not gone in with, the knowledge of what loss actually costs. The music that follows someone who has been that deep and come back is different from the music of someone who has not. Not better in every way, but more complete, more true to what the world actually contains. If you are lying here tonight carrying something, a loss, a grief, a person who is no longer where they were, I want to say something to you. The music that comes from having loved someone, even after the loss, is not diminished by the loss. It is deepened by it. Orpheus's most beautiful music came after the underworld, after the look, after the second loss, after everything. The head still singing, the river still moving, the music still going somewhere it had not yet been. I want to speak very slowly now to whoever is still listening. Somewhere in the ancient world, on the island of Lesbos, in the warm Aegean Sea, in the centuries after the myths were young, people came to hear the oracle of Orpheus. They came with questions. The questions that human beings always carry. What should I do? Will it be all right? How do I bear what I am carrying? And the voice, still the voice of the musician from Thrace, the man who had been to the underworld and come back, and looked back, and lost her again, and been torn apart, and still somehow kept singing. The voice answered. We don't know what it said. The oracles are silent now. The island is quiet. But the fact that people came, the fact that for centuries in the ancient world the head of Orpheus was understood to be still speaking, tells us something. That the thing he had, the gift, the capacity to make music true enough to move the stones and slow the rivers and make the furies weep and move the immovable king of the dead, that thing did not die with him. It cannot die. That is the whole point. Tonight, wherever you are, the music is still going. Not his specifically, but the music that came from what he discovered. That grief, fully inhabited, fully expressed, fully given to the world, becomes something that the world can use. The stones still move toward it. The rivers still listen. Let your breathing slow. Let whatever you are carrying be held by the dark for a while. Not taken, not lost, just held.
the way the river held his head, the way the dark held Eurydice, the way the night holds everything that needs to be carried through it to the morning. You don't have to look back. The music is still there. Rest now. If this reached you tonight, leave a comment, just your city and the time. And if this story found you at the right moment, tell me. Those comments are the reason this channel exists. And if you want more nights like this one, subscribe. We're here every Tuesday, Thursday and Sunday. Same quiet place, same honest voice. Good night, wherever you are.